The hard part, though, is what happens if that next child wants to go to graduate school because Layra is so darn smart that she wants to get a PhD in, I don't know, Dan, whatever Layra wants to get a PhD in.
Unicorns.
Or unicorns, thank you. Or graduate school. She can use that 529 for that schooling as well. Welcome to Critical Thinking Required, hosted by LBW. This podcast is intended for free thinkers, entrepreneurs, and knowledge seekers. Join us as we discuss relevant financial topics, explore with guests their financial journeys, and engage with experts in industries such as space, media and entertainment, real estate, and many more. Buckle up and enjoy the ride. Welcome to Critical Thinking Required. You're with your hosts, Tim Bickmore and Dan Weiss. And we don't have our third guest today, Nathaniel Leach, as he has decided to bow out on this beautiful conversation about 529 plans. So this is going to be part of our Buyer Beware series. Dan and I are going to discuss 529 plans, and we're going to stick to 529 plans. There's other accounts that are out there, but for today's purposes, 529s is big enough to do one podcast on. We probably could do it for a minute, but Dan and I want to make sure it keeps it short and sweet for our listeners and viewers. But before we jump into those, I always like to do a PSA, public service announcement, which is really for us. If you like this episode, please like, share, and subscribe to our podcast channels. Get it? Okay, Dan, I got that out of the way. 529 plans.
Yes. So a 529 plan is a tax advantage savings plan that is really set up for you to pay for education. It could be your own education. We could talk about that. It could be an education typically for a beneficiary, like a child or a grandchild. It's a conversation that we have all the time, and it can be confusing. So we thought we would break it down today. And again, like Tim said, we're just going to focus on this being the main vehicle that we see from a tax benefit standpoint. We'll talk about those tax benefits, but there are other vehicles as well. So why don't we start with why people actually are interested in using a vehicle like this? What are the benefits of a 529 college plan?
Yeah. So 529 plans, there's a lot of advantages to them. They're wonderful accounts if you're specifically trying to save for college education or even private school these days. It can be a good route to be able to save up for private school. In 2017, one of the legislation acts did allow for 529s to allow for K through 12 education to be paid for up to $10,000 per year. But the reason why 529s are so interesting is that there's some tax advantages to it. That can be potentially some tax-free growth within these accounts. So to give you an example, if you were to place in the state of Wisconsin, and I'm specifically using the state of Wisconsin because every state's different from what would be considered a tax deduction. But in the state of Wisconsin, if you were to be able to put money into the account, you will get a state deduction on your state income taxes. Once you put them in, so you get a deduction going in. And then as that account continues to grow, because you can invest it into, let's say, the S&P 500. And so let's say it grows over 18 years. All of that growth that you earn on that account, as long as that account is then used for qualified educational expenses, which can range with a lot of different expenses, when you use that money, it will actually be tax-free as well. So going out would be tax-free. So there really is a lot of tax advantages in the sense that you can get a state deduction potentially, depending on the state that you live in. And then you can allow it to grow tax-free going forward, both on the state and federal level when used for educational expenses. So it's a huge incentive for be able to save for college, which is great. And that's why a lot of people use them, because then other options would be just saving in a brokerage account where you're going to get taxed on any buys or sells, or even when you do sell to be able to fund said education, you're going to get hit with long-term, short-term. You may have dividends, ordinary gains. It depends on how you would invest those funds. So the tax benefit or advantage is really what drives people to use these types of accounts, and the flexibility. I can't stress enough that what is considered an educational expense is quite wide. So the flexibility of what it can be used for within the educational realm is really handy.
I want to highlight a couple things that you said there, Tim. So for one, we've talked about the power of Roth IRAs before and commonly do. This works in a similar fashion where you're putting money away and the growth is tax free as long as it's used for qualified expenses, right? A Roth IRA is retirement expenses, right? That's what qualifies it. This is schooling related. And if you want to really zero in as to what that is, you can go to the irs.gov site and see what that listing looks like. And Tim also mentioned too, they can be very generous. We have some people that have kids that go to schools out of this country, right? That those schoolings can actually be at times covered by a US 529 plan. Now, the ticket to get across the pond, if you want to go study at Oxford, that's not going to be covered, but the plane ticket that is. But a lot of the educational costs indeed will be. The other thing Tim mentioned, besides the growth, the tax-free growth, if used for qualified accounts, is this deduction. That's a nice benefit. Not all states have that. So, for example, the bulk of our Texas, right, where you don't have income taxes, you do not have that deduction come into play. California, where the bulk of our clientele come from, there is no state deduction. It's been talked about in California a couple of years ago, but the governor vetoed that. It was going to be a big deduction, 10 grand. In Wisconsin, the deduction just moved up for this year slightly, is now $3,380 per beneficiary that you can take as a deduction if you put your money into a Wisconsin qualified plan. I will put in my own opinion on this. If indeed you are a Wisconsin resident and you are looking for a deduction on a plan like this, which we could, it's not too shabby. You get a couple $100 off your taxes. Fine, right? It's better than getting nothing. There are two plans that are going to do that in this state: Tomorrow Scholar and EdVest. Tim and I are big believers in EdVest. We'll talk how the investment structure can look inside of these plans, but they tend to be very simple. They tend to be indexed components and very simple investment allocations. And this is different than if we're talking about an adult planning for a specific goal or retirement, where there's a lot of unknowns as to when you're going to use those funds and how. Not in this case. We pretty much have a really good idea as to when and how you're going to use these funds. It doesn't take a lot of effort because of the lack of options and the known scenario to really put that investment concept into play. Therefore, we highly recommend that in this state that a person actually take advantage of the 17 options inside of the EdVest plan, as opposed to something like Tomorrow Scholar, where you're going to pay more fees because Tomorrow Scholar is going to give a kickback to the advisor for what we would say is very little work.
Agreed.
So that's why people use it on the pro side. Major tax savings, right? Including a deduction, potentially, depending on the state. There are some challenges that these also present. So maybe we can get out some of the potential cons.
Yeah, of course. As we always like to say, whenever we're giving advice, it depends. Depends on what you're trying to achieve, and it depends on what variables and what you want to kind of look at. Before I jump into that too, I just want to emphasize on the state deduction. What we sometimes do see is people are not aware that their state may have a deduction or that they can receive it. And an advisor has sold them, let's say, the Virginia 529 plan.
We see that one all the time.
Yeah. And maybe they're in the state of Wisconsin, and it's time for you to move out of that state's plan, because I don't believe it has reciprocity with the state of Wisconsin, and go open up an account with EdVest specifically, like Dan's talking about, so you can start receiving that deduction. So just doing some due diligence on what you own, where it is, what state you're owning in, is something that is important. I would like to make a caveat that there are reciprocity states, meaning you could be in one state's plan and still receive a state deduction. But you just, again, have to do the due diligence, make sure you understand that if it is or is not. Just wanted to throw that out there because we have seen that before. And so just so people can start getting that deduction if they're making the contributions anyway.
And one other benefit, I guess, before we talk about some cons, as Tim was talking state by state, the amount that you can put into a plan like this I mean, it's pretty significant, and it will
Mhm.
vary state by state. But in Wisconsin, for example, the top limit I think is what, Tim, $472,000, the lifetime of
Correct.
plan.
So yeah,
So that's
that's the total account balance, which don't fund it that much, but we'll talk about that. But yeah, that is the maximum account balance that you can hold. State of Washington is, it looks like, a half a million. West Virginia is $265,620. So it varies state to state, like Dan's mentioning. But for the state of Wisconsin specifically, $472,000 is the max balance amount. So
uh, on the con side. The con that comes up is what happens if my typically kid doesn't go to school,
yes,
and thus we use the money for something else. That's really the con that we hear, and Tim's talking about from like overfunding standpoint and so on. So let's spend a little time and talk about what that con looks like. What happens if you need to move that money? What happens if you take a distribution and so on?
sure. So the account's set up to incentivize the account holder and the beneficiary to use it for educational expenses. So, in order to continue to incentivize that, what the government has done is said, hey, if you don't use this money for qualified educational expenses, we're going to A, tax any growth that you've earned on that account. And then B, we're going to throw on a 10% penalty because you did that. So, to give you an example, like Dan just said, let's say that you save for your children's education and they say, hey, mom and dad, I'm not going to school. I don't want to do it. I'm going to go and road trip for 4 years around the United States. Let's just say that. And you're like, okay, I understand it. Let's buy your van for you so you can go do that and experience, the United States. If you went and used the 529 account to buy that van, that be considered an educational expense via the IRS. What would then happen is that any growth within that time frame, you're going to be taxed at income tax rates, whatever your income tax rate are at the time, and then you're going to have to add on an additional 10% penalty. So the other thing when we're talking about non-funding is, what if all of a sudden you're saving up, your kid's really excited to go to school, and they get a D1 scholarship in athletics. Well, all of a sudden now that 529 plan can't be used. Let's say it's an only child, can't transfer it. And so then what do? You're kind of stuck in the sense that if you take that money out, you're going to have to pay income taxes and a 10% penalty. There is some things that we could talk about, aka switching the beneficiary to yourself, getting maybe Rosetta Stone, going back to school, but eventually you'll have to use it for educational expenses specifically. So when Dan and I talk a lot about planning, I think, a huge conversation, at least with the younger generation, I'll say millennials who are starting to have children, is that where is college going to be when my kid reaches college age? Is it going to be completely subsidized by the government? That's a big conversation. Is it going to be really universities are no longer around because you can get as much education on YouTube or the internet, right? Is their educator. So a lot of people have different viewpoints on where the college system in the United States is progressing or moving. And that scares people about putting money into the 529. Dan and I do bring this up and say, yeah, you know what? That is a legitimate concern. That could happen. It could also not happen. It could be exact same way it is today. And then the other issue is that college is also increasing at a rapid rate. So you also have to anticipate that even if it doesn't change, well, if you don't start saving now, you may be in a big world of hurt as well. So there's definitely a balance, and it's definitely having a conversation and a goal of how much do you want to pay for? What does this really look like? And then allocating it appropriately. Because what you could always do, like Dan talks about very well, he talks about this with his own daughter, is open up a non-qualified account, fund it. And if Leora one day says, hey, Dad, I want to go travel in a van for 4 years. I don't want to go to school. Dan could say, A, go have fun. I'm going to use this money for a really, really cool trip. Or B, I'll help you fund that van. Or C, maybe I'll use it for my retirement funds, because there's no restrictions around that non-qualified account. Dan can do as he chooses, but what he's giving up is the tax advantage over those years within that 529 account. So there's pros and cons. There's definitely ways to think about it. And there's always a hybrid approach. You could do both. It just depends on what the objectives are of the family and the individual or couple that are trying to plan for their children's future.
Yeah, and Carrie and I take that hybrid approach, right? We have one daughter. We will really promote her to find higher education with whatever that means to her. But we are saving in an EdVest account in addition to a non-qualified account. And like Tim said, if I don't really like what she's doing, if Carrie's not happy with that, then we're going to use that money for something else. And we'll talk about what that actually means and why that separates. And then we also then have a small amount in a custodial account, which I think it probably does make sense to bring that up, that we will fund for her as well too. What is that money for? I don't know. If she wants to go on a date with somebody or to the mall, if malls exist then, whatever be the case, it's there. But I'm not going to pour $50,000 into a custodial account for her. Because when she turns 8, it depends on the state, but 18 or 21, that's not mine and Carrie's money anymore. That is her money. That is Leora's money, and she could do whatever she pleases with it. And we always joke when we talk about estate planning matters that, with the exception of one person that we know, one client, I don't care how smart this an 18-year-old is or how well behaved they are, they don't tend to make great decisions when hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars gets dropped in their lap when they turn 18. So it is a hybrid approach because we're taking the risk that if she doesn't go to school, then Carrie and I are looking, well, what do we do with this 529 plan? If we take it out, we're going to be penalized. Taxes, like Tim said, and then highlighting that 10% penalty. So what are those options? And we're also taking the risk on the other side because we're giving up the tax benefits if she does go to school. So we are mixing it. So,
and as you're talking, Dan, I'm thinking, being in our client's shoes and being like, well, I'll just maybe pay off, my loans, my student loans.
Which is real. We had a client that had an advisor tell her to do this with a 529 plan.
And you can't. It would not be considered a non-qualified or a qualified educational expense. So you can't do that. You're going to get penalized. You could still take it out and pay for it. Don't get me wrong. Like, you can do it, but it's not a smart move to think that you're going to save and then get this nice tax benefit without any penalty or issues once you take it out to pay student loans. So it's a nice thought, but it will cause a penalty. Now, if Leora gets a scholarship because she's a genius, and she's wonderful, then yeah, you can maybe look at the consequences and be like, hey, maybe we just take this out and knock out loans that we didn't have. But you could use it for any loan. You pay down your house, but you're still going to pay those penalties for both income taxation on growth and then the 10% penalty. So I just wanted to throw that out there because that's a common.
You're right. So what happens if, for example, Carrie and I have overfunded that 529 because we just put too much in there and she didn't need to use it, Leora, that is, or B, Leora does not go to school. Then we're talking about, which is a common question we get, who can I transfer this money to?
Good question. And I do think if Leora was able to get that money, and if these were real, I think I know what she would buy. She'd definitely buy a unicorn. But that's not on this topic, but I do think she'd buy a unicorn if she could. So that might be that might be a horse for you, Dan. But yes, who can we transfer the assets to is a great question. You can transfer it to anybody in your family. Now, I'm going to read this off the IRS website because it is a little long. But what consists of family? Family consists of, via the IRS, son, daughter, stepchild, foster child, adopted child, or descendant of any of them, brother, sister, stepbrother, or stepsister, father or mother or ancestor of either, stepfather or stepmother, son or daughter or brother or sister, or father or mother, son-in-law, daughter-in-law, father-in-law, mother-in-law, brother-in-law, or sister-in-law, the spouse of any individual listed above, and first cousin. I feel like I was Dr. Seuss right there as I was reading through it, but that is what is consistent of family. So there's a really broad range of who you can actually transfer this asset to. And what we mean by transfer is, let's say Dan is the owner of Leora's account and Leora is the beneficiary. Let's say that then Dan has a first cousin that he wants to move these funds to because Leora got a scholarship. And so what he could do is he could go ahead and transfer the beneficiary from Leora to the first cousin, and that first cousin could then use these funds in the same manner as Leora. One thing that you have to think about, though, is I'm going to use Dan's wonderful mother as an example. Let's say that his mother owns the account. Okay. And Dan was the beneficiary, but Dan was so smart that he didn't have to use some of that money. And so his mom said, well, I'm going to wait till you have kids and I'll transfer that.
It wasn't smart, Tim. It was so poor that financially it covered it, but thank you.
I was trying to give you the benefit of the doubt.
I appreciate that.
You're welcome. Right. There's two of us. So you have, your mother to then you, and then she's, I'm going to wait to give this to Leora. And then let's say she changes the beneficiary to Leora. That is her grandchild. Technically speaking, what you've done is you've removed more than one generation, which is going to enact what's called the generational skipping tax. So there is a potential gift tax on that. Now, there is what's called a GST tax exemption or a generational skipping tax exemption that you can use. It's a lifetime amount, very similar to the estate exemption that people are very aware of. So you can use that, but you have to be aware that that technically would turn into a gift, whatever that balance may be. But it can happen. But if you're skipping generations, you just have to pay attention to that one little nuance. But if Dan were to move, let's say Dan had another child and Leora, he could transfer that from one to the other, no problem, because it's on the same generational level from Dan. So it's whoever the account owner is, and then what generation is it removed from them. If it's one or more, you have to pay attention to that small nuance. So I know that's a mouthful for just looking at what beneficiaries is, but what it does is that if you have multiple children, then you can shift from beneficiary to beneficiary. However, people talk about this a lot. I want to open one account. You cannot open up just one account. You have to open up an account per beneficiary because you cannot bucket it up. We also suggest that typically, depending on ages of children, it can get really, really hard because maybe both the children are going to school at the same time, which means that we have to be able to fund that. And if we're using these funds, only these funds for those reasons, you can't do both at the same time. You can only fund one at a time. So then sometimes it just makes sense, even though sometimes it's a pain to have multiple accounts, to have separate accounts for each. If they're separated enough, let's say they're 5-6 years apart, totally get it. We could do one account, use it. The hard part though is what happens if that next child wants to go to graduate school because Leora is so darn smart that she wants to get a PhD in, I don't know, Dan, whatever Leora wants to get a PhD in. Unicorns, thank you. Or graduate school. She can use that 529 for that schooling as well. So if you're all of a sudden planning and then that next child doesn't get to catch it because they're going to use it, you have to be conscious. So there is some thought process to it, making sure, okay, what do I think? And I know we're talking usually about Leora, who's 4 years old, and who knows where Leora is going to be when she's 18. But it's just stuff to kind of process through where, what risk do you want to take? For me, I just open up 2 accounts, cut the risk, understand that I can switch it from one to another and go from there. Fun. Because another really cool thing about a 529 is, let's say your grandparents are being really generous and they want to gift some money to the grandkids for college specifically. Let's say that they have a decent amount of money and they're looking to reduce their estate. They can actually do what's called the 5-year gift rule, and they can bucket up 5 years worth of contributions to the plan and do it all in one lump sum. So $15,000 per beneficiary per year is what's allowed with the estate tax limit. So let's just say that they're just a grandma, no grandfather, just a grandma. She can do 75 grand in one lump sum and still be underneath the annual gift exemption via the IRS. It's a one-time thing, but you could give up to 75,000 and front load a 529. It really can be a wonderful way to go about that for grandparents if they're looking for ways to reduce potentially their estate. And what's even great about that is what happens is if it's a couple, right, they could actually give twice as much of that, which I'm just going to do the math quick, which would be $150,000 in 1 year they could gift. So from a gifting perspective, talking about a whole nother generation, it could make a lot of sense if someone is in the position to be giving that kind of money, which would be just wonderful, obviously, for the grandchildren. And it could be a really big benefit for the grandparents as well. And it truly is could be a win-win scenario, but needs to be talked about, needs to be planned. That money goes away and all that other fun stuff. But it's just another opportunity.
One thing too that we've kind of mentioned, skirted a little on too, is the titling, which we should probably highlight a little bit more too. So Tim mentioned if the 529 is in my name, Carrie's name, and then like that's an important factor for a number of reasons. One is who controls that money. So if like going back to the custodial example, if I don't have to worry about Leora just taking that money if it's in a 529 and doing whatever she wants with it, because it's in our name. It's not controlled by her. So there's clearly that piece, as opposed to if it was a custodial money or in her name directly, where she could go ahead and take those funds and do what she wants with it. The other place this comes into play, though, that really Tim has a lot of conversation about, is how this impacts a family's ability to apply for financial aid.
Yeah, good point. So what happens is that if you, depending on the titling of accounts, that's what when a family fills out a FAFSA form, the government's going to go ahead and or the FAFSA form is going to look at the what the parents' assets are, their income, whoever's the dependent, so whoever is the parent, and then they're also going to look at the child's income. They're going to look at those UTIMA accounts, UJIMA accounts, and what they do is within the formula to figure out what the earned, I think it's EIC, earned income, or like what essentially a family can provide. I forget the acronym. That essentially is calculated based off percentages of each the parents and or the children's assets. So they typically weight the children's assets heavier, meaning, hey, this child is going to use the majority of their funds for college specifically, where they look at the parents' assets and they say, well, you may have other things going on, such as other kids. So we're going to lessen the percentage of what we think you should be putting towards college for this child. So if that 529 plan account is in Dan's name, they're going to weight that on a less basis relative for it to being a Utah or UJIM account that's in Leora's name technically, because she will be owner of that account at some point. So it's something to be kind of strategic about and understand that the FAFSA form is going to weigh that heavier, same amount of assets, same everything, but just different titling of an account can change how they're going to view that asset, which means that that's going to limit the amount that they can get within financial aid. So sometimes this doesn't matter because families make enough money where they're not going to get a lot of financial aid. But for families that really can benefit from this type of work, it really is something important. And even if they contribute some amount of money, they should really look at it doing as the parents own that asset. There's a lot of other things too. So for example, forget about FAFSA. Dan just mentioned, we're talking about Leora. So I'm going to use our unicorn example. Is if it is a UTIMA UJIM account, that account she will own. She'll be the beneficiary as well as own it, which means that she can go to, let's say, EdVest, and she can say, screw this school, right? I don't want to do it anymore. I'm buying a damn unicorn. And she can go and do that, and she'll get hit with the penalties and all and the taxes and everything. So she can take that money out. It's restrictive from the sense that you'll get penalized for using for anything other than education, but you still have access to those funds regardless. It's just, do you want to take the penalty? And sometimes maybe that individual doesn't understand that, doesn't know it, or is very aware of it and just says, screw it, I want to use it for something else. So it's just something also to just kind of pay attention to. So FAFSA, they're going to weigh it heavier if the parents own it, or less if the parents own it. They're going to weigh it heavier if the child owns it, which is that UTIMA, UJIMA titling.
Yeah. So if I want to know, if Leora is 18 and going to school, and I need to start using this money, how am I going to get my hands on this money for these purposes?
Yeah, so I can speak directly from like the EdVest example. Is you can go ahead and you can get withdrawals directly ACHs to your checking account. Now, I don't know if every 529 plan across the United States is the same way. I would hope that everybody's got to like ACH payments and moving one account to the other, but it could be a check that's coming out directly or something in that manner. But typically for EdVest, what's going to happen is you can go ahead and just shift money from your EdVest account, just like another bank account, and move that money over to your checking account. And then you can pay that tuition bill. You can pay for that computer. You can pay rent or whatever it may be. Now, one thing that we do recommend, and you should talk to your CPA. I am not a CPA, nor is Dan, but you should definitely talk. But what we would recommend is keeping receipts or at least documentation of what has been spent, in case one day the IRS comes knocking on your door and says, hey, remember how you had that 529 plan? Did you actually use it for, qualified expenses? Because that unicorn, I'm not really sure that's right. So it's just to be able to keep receipts to be able to prove what you have going on. Again, talk to a CPA about it. Another nuance to what's considered a qualified expense. So I'm going to use the University of Wisconsin-Madison because I talk about it quite a bit. Is at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and mostly every other public school, and I believe private schools, will set out what they feel tuition costs are, room and board, and miscellaneous, and so on and so forth. So at the University of Wisconsin, most students stay in dorms, like maybe that's their first year, and then they actually live off campus, technically not in the dorms, and do private housing. So what's going to happen is that in order to qualify for that private housing, technically speaking, you can only use a qualified expense is only as much as the university states what housing is going to cost. So, for
Great
example,
point.
let's say that University of Wisconsin says $1,500 for housing per month, and your children find a really cool place for $3,000 per month, and there's only let's say $4,000 per month, and there's only two of them staying at this place, so they're gonna have to pay $2,000 a month in housing, right? That extra $500, technically speaking, is not a qualified expense based on how the IRS is going to look at it. So it's just something to take into consideration, something to understand that's specifically for room and board. But outside of that, from an execution standpoint, ACH to your bank, pay for it, keep track of the receipts, understand some of the nuances when it comes to housing and other things if they're off campus. But outside of that, it's just really looking at what's an educational expense. If you're, for example, in Texas and you're going to fund your children's 529 and you're thinking that you're going to use the 529 because you're going to get this tax-free growth, if you're going to use it for like pre-K or even up to 12, it really is time frame. And so to invest in that and then to be able to use it for tax-free, you may lose money if you're invested in the market and it's a short time frame. So just be very conscious of, does it actually make sense to use it? It sounds really cool, but if you don't have the time for it to allow to grow in the market, it just may not make sense.
Yeah.
Again, it depends, but it's it's interesting. It's just time frame and looking at investments and how aggressive a risky you really want to get with it. So just to throw that out there.
Glad you brought up, Tim, the understanding what the cost is compared to what you actually go and get and what it will fund, the difference between and so on.
Yeah,
Like the housing example.
It's a small nuance that a lot of people just aren't aware
People
of.
miss it a lot. And as Leora would say, and I think we've used her a lot, so I'll have to make like an extra, talk to Karen, make an extra contribution to her 529 after this. So just a final thought and from the two of us, and thank you everybody for, of course, tuning in. I'll make mine short and sweet. Education can free you, but it is not free.
That's so good. I mean, I hope Leora buys her unicorn personally, but on a side note,
I don't know
to throw out there, you probably don't feel the same. You're like, oh man, yeah. Anyways, but to buy a unicorn, my final thought is just really paying attention to some of the nuances when it comes to any of these accounts. Where we call this podcast or this episode or series "Buyer Beware," because there's a lot of simplicity to this, but there's also then the nuances and complexity that come with it. And it just depends on what you're trying to achieve. It's about optimizing your decision making. And sometimes at the end of the day, it's gray. So to say I want to fully fund a 529 because I think my kid's going to go to MIT, do you really want to take that risk? What are the potential consequences? And at the end of the day, if you decide, yeah, absolutely, I want to do it, but you're fully educated on that decision, then I'm down. I'm with it 100%. But where I don't like when people make decisions is just not having all of the information. And so just talk to a professional, try to vet it as much as possible, understand the nuances so that you can make an educated decision on depending on how you want to go about it. And there's not a right or wrong answer. There's definitely a monetary benefit, but there could also be a stress-related benefit. So it's just, again, it depends on what you want to do, understanding the product, and moving forward.
Thank you, everybody, for joining today. As always, we appreciate your participation and hope that this episode was a helpful one. Until next time, have a wonderful evening. Take care of yourself.
Thank you for taking the time to start your journey of thinking differently and listening to LBW talk about stuff they love. Until next time.